This book just came out. It's quite an adventure, and it was fun writing it. As I mentioned to many of you in letters, after finishing finishing The Promise of Immortality, I thought, well, let me relax a little and just write the story of Ananda. So I was able to relax for a while, but I found that I was gripped by this story. It's a real page turner. I couldn't wait to see what happened. And in fact, it has been a joy to write. It's certainly not an easy story. It's very dramatic in many places. But I feel that it's very important. I feel that it's for many years I have not said things that I've said here. I have felt the need to, and then I felt, well, but I don't want to hurt Master's organization. Finally, I realized that his work is not the organization, it's his teachings, and the teachings are being hurt and need to be clarified in certain ways, and therefore I have felt right in writing it. So anyway, it's really a good story, and I think you'll enjoy it. It ties in very closely to the subject today, dogmatism versus common sense. You know, it happened very interestingly to me, these divine coincidences. I was in India, and I could feel that there was great rage against me on the part of Tara Mata, and particularly she, because of their total disagreement with what I had been trying to do to build the work in India. I still believe in what I was doing, but it was not a belief shared by them. And I was thinking, I was in seclusion in the Himalayas, and I was thinking that I read an article in SPAN magazine. SPAN is the United States Information Service magazine, at least that's its name in India. And I read there an article by the head of the philosophy department at MIT. And it was on an aspect of modern thinking. You know, living in a monastery, you don't necessarily keep in touch with everything that goes on out in the world. In fact, it was curious, one time at a church service in Hollywood, many years ago, 1954 or 5, I mentioned something about boogie-woogie music, which I didn't like anyway, but it was the last popular trend I knew about. And afterwards, some woman said to me, "Don't you know it isn't rock and roll anymore?" I said, "Oh, really? Well, what is it?" "No, it isn't boogie-woogie anymore. What is it?" She said, "Rock and roll." I said, "Well, how long has this been going on?" And she said, "Well, it's been popular for 5 years." So you can see that I was quite out of it in certain ways. And the thing that this article wrote about was the trend in modern thinking toward believing that nothing has any meaning. And he quoted the philosophers and their thinking, which was based on the thought that Einsteinian relativity means that moral values are just relative to the occasion and to the need and to the opinion and the mores, but there's no ultimate truth in any moral value. One. Second, that biology says that because evolution is completely accidental, therefore there's no meaning in life, because life just happened as an accident. And I forgot the third, but there was a third basic thing there. And I read this stuff and I thought, well, can't anybody speak up? I found that all the intelligent people were buying into those lines of argument. And so I thought, well, a book is really needed, because I had been studying master's teachings for 13, 14 years. I had been studying Vedanta philosophy and the teachings of India for all those years. I had seen clearly that these arguments were based on fallacious thinking. And so I thought it would be wonderful to write such a book. Then I thought, well, nobody seems to be doing it. Maybe I should. Master had told me to write and lecture. Those were his instructions to me for my life work. And I was thinking of this when I got the telegram from SRF summoning me to New York, a safe 3,000 miles from Los Angeles, and booting me out on my ear, which of course was a tragedy for me at the time, but was perhaps the greatest blessing I've ever had, at least in my work. It did not feel like a blessing, but certainly this place would not be possible. None of the things I've done would have been possible. Nothing that my life has, whatever little contribution I've been able to make, would have been possible if I had not been pushed out on my own, and I would never have gone out on my own because I was too absolutely loyal. So it was a blessing in that sense. It was a blessing also, I hope, in the sense that it must have cleared out an awful lot of karma. And whatever the case, one of the first things that came to me after I was on my own and thinking, what am I going to do with my life, was this book. And I studied all sorts of philosophers and biologists and so on. And in the process, I tried to do just what I would not have done while I was in SRF, which was I would have always looked at things from the standpoint of how everybody else thought around me that I was used to. That made a lot of sense to me. But I saw that that was not the way to convince all these people who really were confused by that way of thinking. Because whatever else those people were, they weren't stupid. They had used reason very cleverly in order to get people into a line of reasoning and bring them to solutions that were absolutely false. Now here is the problem between dogma and common sense. Dogma is not just religious. Certainly we know all about religious dogma, but science has all kinds of dogmas. Society has all kinds of dogmas. I remember some friends came over to Italy not very long ago, and the son of this person who was about 17 or so, he said, well, is Italy a third world country? Well, you know, it's one of the 7 big ones, as they call them, the giants. But people's the ideas are so circumscribed, so narrow, that the tendency is to think that anybody who thinks differently, talks a different language, they must be a cuckoo in some way. There must be something wrong with them. And it takes a little while, and I think this is one great fortune I've had in my life, traveling all over the world all my life. I started at the age of 6 months and haven't stopped. And I found that people really are just like me. They're people. I'll never forget, because I was born in Romania, at the age of 3, landing in London and finding, my God, taxi drivers talk English. Porters speak English. Maids and waiters speak English. What is this? Unthinkable. But this is the way we gradually learn that human beings really aren't that different. Some may like curry, others may like guacamole, others may like pasta. They all want something in their stomachs. And so, bit by bit, we begin to realize that the races of man do not change humanity. What does change humanity are certain subtler things, our directions of growth, what we're looking for and how we're looking for it. And you can't say that there are absolute dogmas in these things, because although values are not absolute, they are relative. This is a very important distinction to understand. Most people confuse absolute with relativity. I mean, they think it has to be absolute, not relative, that relativity means that it can't be absolute. But absolute is not a really important issue. There are no absolutes outside of God. But there are universalities. There are universal truths. And this, in a directional sense, is something that, for example, and a very good example, supposing Jesus had wakened up one morning and said, I'm tired of serving humanity, I want to become a millionaire. Even the most gross materialist would say, what's wrong with this man? He's failed in some important way. And if the most lazy person in the world who didn't do anything suddenly woke up one morning and said, I'm going to become a millionaire, wouldn't even saints applaud? We all know that values are directional. We all know that there's good, better, and best. We all know that what is true for one person doesn't make it necessarily false for another, but may not make it quite yet true, or maybe something that is no longer necessary. Their values are relative. And in that relativity, we have to realize that although, for example, I saw a photograph of extraordinary photos of the 20th century, and this one was extraordinary, just unbelievable. A group of cannibals in New Guinea, or Old Guinea, or whatever it is. Anyway, a group of cannibals gathered around the feast of a corpse. Not a pleasant picture. What was many times less pleasant was the look of unholy glee in their faces. Something that I've never seen in my life. But it was such a gross, debasing kind of joy that they were feeling. You cannot say that, well, they have their opinion of joy, we have our opinion of joy. It isn't the same thing. People try to say in moral philosophy that, well, they have a right to their opinion. Sure, they have a right to their opinion. Everybody has a right to his own delusions. This does not make it a right opinion. There are directions. Now, what helps to, because there's no absolute, how can we anchor it down in such a way as to give it a direction toward something better? Something that Yogananda pointed out in his book, Science of Religion, that every creature wants two things in life. I've said this recently already, worth repeating. First of all, everybody, not only every human being, every animal, wants to escape pain, discomfort, however he defines pain. Everyone wants happiness. Now that happiness is really only I know some atheist came to me in Australia once years ago and he said, well, I'm an atheist. And Karuna, I hope I haven't got that wrong. You try with these accents, but faced with the genuine article, you know. He said, how can you talk about God? How can you define God in such a way that I can respect it? I said, well, I paused a moment and I said, well, why did you think of God? And I did say God, not God. I said, why don't you think of God as the highest potential you can imagine for yourself? And he was sort of shocked. He was thinking I was going to give him some big dogmatic definition that he could blow down with something or other. And he said, well, I can live with that. And it's a fact. You see, if we talk of happiness, yes, happiness is the goal of all creatures. But happiness is not the goal of a great saint. Because how do you define happiness? He doesn't think in terms of his own happiness. Jesus didn't go giggling to the cross. You can be sure it was not happiness that he was seeking in that, but he was seeking bliss. And happiness is the precursor of bliss. And so happiness itself is a definition that only is on the way to something absolute, yes. But all of us want to escape pain. Pain of emotion, pain of bereavement, pain of loss, pain of betrayal. How many pains we experience in life. And all of us want to find some sort of haven, of peace, of rest, of happiness. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita, how is, for the peaceless person, how is happiness possible? Peace is a necessary condition of happiness. And the restless kind of peace that you find, I remember I was talking to some woman in London who was connected with us by a relative. And she was absolutely into rock and roll. I told her, well, I like Mozart personally. She said, Mozart, he's dead. Well, he isn't dead. That's the difference. She's dead already. He isn't. Death has nothing to do with your physical body. It has everything to do with your state of consciousness. And that's why Jesus said, let the dead bury their dead. You're surrounded by a bunch of cadavers. But I don't mean in this room. And why don't I mean it? Because I see light in your eyes. That's what is so sad when you go into places in the world and see people whose eyes have no light. There's no enjoyment, there's no inspiration, there's no laughter. And so the purpose of life is to find that laughter. I remember back when I was in high school and college, I wanted truth. I didn't know what truth was, but I decided truth was not how many galaxies there are in the universe, or how far it is from here to the moon, or all sorts of scientific facts. I felt that truth had to be joy, inspiration, because that's what we're all looking for. I knew this thing intuitively when I found Master and heard his writings and teachings, read them. I found out that that's what I had been looking for. But in modern philosophy, they say, well, after all, the cannibals and Bora Bora or wherever it is, they have a right to their opinion. Sure, everybody has a right to his opinion. I would rather they didn't try eating me, but after all, once I'm gone, it doesn't much matter. The thing is that when you live in the right way, you will find that you have what you want. And they, in their philosophy, they said, for example, that the many tribes in Africa believe that to be kind is a sign of weakness. Well, that is not just their opinion. It just doesn't work. Somebody who is not kind to others finds that somehow they don't expect anybody to be kind to them. If you don't expect other people to be kind to you, you're going to be defensive. If you're defensive, you're going to be tense. If you're tense, you're not going to be happy. And there are, and this is another example I read in some of that philosophy that I studied to write this book, there are gypsies in Tuscany who believe that not to be able to tell a lie efficiently is a sign not only that you're not competent in telling lies, but that there's no truth in you. Well, you'd say these values are topsy-turvy. But you go to Tuscany and you look at those peasants and you don't find one that inspires. They have not found the right handle on how to live. And if you look at life, and this is something in my slideshow on different worlds where you see people in many different countries, all the different ways of living, thinking, habits, customs, languages, races, you'll see that there are some things that make faces radiant, and there are some things that make faces closed down. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there was this one girl in a restaurant outside cafe in Lugano, and she was just a teenager, but she had such a heavy countenance. She was smoking like this. Already, you could see her at 80 and just think, what a tragedy. But she can change, and that's another beautiful thing. This is one of the lovely things that we experience here at Ananda, that people come not necessarily with such a pulled-down attitude as that, they wouldn't come, but people whose faces are lined with worry and care and tension and so on. And in just a few days, even a weekend, you see some of those lines disappeared. You see a sweetness and a peace. People change by what they do. People change by their attitude. People change by their customs. But to say that values don't exist because they vary with different countries is simply a fallacy. And because of this fallacy, people say, oh, there's no God, oh, there's no truth, it's all relative. And so people, in the name of relativity, are willing to do just about anything and excuse it, saying, well, there's no one to tell me I've done wrong anyway. And so, as I mentioned in this book here, there was this boy who told me he'd been in a restaurant with a professor of his, and the professor pocketed a spoon, and the boy was sort of surprised. I mean, the professor ought to know better than that. He said, why'd you do that? The professor said, oh, it's all relative. Well, relative to what? I mean, so the restaurant lost a spoon and he got one. Is that the relativity? I spit on that kind of relativity. No. Relativity means that you can be more generous and still more generous, and in the process still more happy. That the more you do of the right things, the more you have of what you want. The less you do, the less you have of what you want. It's quite that simple. And then also with the relativity of consciousness, like that James Crow, his name was. He was a psychologist who wrote an article and said, like a rhetorical question, has man changed more by evolving a brain than an elephant has by evolving a trunk? Well, I mean, you haven't laughed. I did laugh. I thought, what nonsense. And he expected people to say, well, no, of course not. It's all the same. Well, no. Because if you look at evolution, you'll see that there's always a premium on intelligence. There's always a premium on a desire for awareness. If you look at the evolution of life forms, you see that those that are intelligent evolve more quickly. Whereas there's at the Monterey Aquarium, there is a clam that for 15 years it goes. And in 15 years, it finally hollows out enough in this rock to be able to sink down into it and grab things as they go by and eat. 15 years. I think you might get bored in that length of time. The variety in this universe is just unbelievable. But there is something, even in that clam, that makes it at least interested to know about this particular life form that's coming by that it can suck in. Even that little bit of wish to know is a reaching out. And so it is that life does evolve. And it evolves not in the direction of a larger trunk. It does evolve in the direction of more intelligence. And when it reaches the human level, it evolves toward wanting to know more and wanting to understand more. And so the dogmas that you find in modern philosophy and science are only that, dogmas. One interesting comparison between the dogmas in religion and the dogmas in science are that religion at least holds to its guns, whereas science every 10 years throws everything out the window and starts over. But in fact, we have to use common sense. And what is common sense? What is the basis of it? It's quite simply experience. Does it jibe with your experience? Yogananda taught us that, and it was delightful to listen to his kind of reasoning. Somebody asked him, well, what about confession? And the priest absolves you. Does he not have the power to absolve? And Yogananda said, well, ask yourself if he can absolve you of the sin of overeating the night before and the stomachache you have now as a result. Can he cure your stomachache? If he can, then sure, he's a true priest. But the mere fact that he can claim this because he's been ordained doesn't make him that. In other words, use your common sense. Does it work? When people talk about heaven and hell, use your common sense. You can't really tell who gets to heaven or how. You can say that nobody's really come back to tell us if he made it. So if people are, the less the possibility of proving a point, the greater the tendency to dogmatize about it. But once you can prove it, well, here's something you can prove. It was beautifully illustrated in a story about Yogananda. that he was on a train. And he was wearing orange, which he usually didn't do in public. I presume he was going to give a lecture. And there was this Orthodox priest who saw him there, and a preacher, and he was very outraged to see this heathen in this Christian land. How Christian, I don't know, but anyway, that was his view of it. And so he was storming up and down, looking at him and looking at him. Finally he said, "Are you a Christian?" And Yogananda said, "Well, yes, I think I am." "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?" "Yes, I do." Well, this wasn't at all the answer he wanted, of course. So he was getting more and more hot under the collar and angry. He said, "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your only Savior?" And Master said, "I accept God as my Savior." And Jesus certainly was one who was able to effect that salvation, but not the only one. "Unless you accept Jesus Christ as your only Savior, you will go to hell." And Yogananda looked at him peacefully and calmly and said, "Well, my dear friend, I may get there by and by, but you're there already." The thing is, everybody in the car laughed because it was so patently obvious. This man's face was lined with fury. And Yogananda was completely peaceful. Look at life. Decide from the effects. By their fruits you shall know them, as Jesus said here in the Bible. Look at the effect of people's beliefs. Do they make them more peaceful? And fine. If they don't, not so fine. And many people, in the name of all sorts of dogmas, have done many things that aren't good at all. Do you know that a year ago was the birthday, I think it's the 500th anniversary of Torquemada. Torquemada, as you know, was the great butcher of the Spanish Inquisition. And the church was writing about how he was basically very misunderstood. He was just a humble monk, and he did it out of love. Well, love for something, but not the people he was crucifying, burning at the stake and so on. And they said that the stories about him had been greatly exaggerated. Well, so he only burned 900 people at the stake, not 1,000. This is exaggerated. It's amazing what the kind of bind that people can get themselves into when they just use their heads. We have to check with common sense. If it's okay for the Pope to do something, let me ask myself, is it okay for me to do it? If it isn't okay for me, then it's not okay for the Pope. If it isn't okay for me to be unkind, ruthless, rapacious, cruel, and persecuting of others, then it cannot be justified in the name of religion. In the universe, it is said that the electron is the key to the universe. This is one of the things said by physicists. In human life, in human society, it's the individual that is the key to society. And what doesn't work for the individual will not work just because many people are doing it. And you can't say that because so many people are doing it, therefore it's right. This was in Rudyard Kipling's book, The Jungle Book. You all remember it, the Bandarlog, the monkey people. And their constant saying was, "We all say so, so it must be true." Well, look around you. Does truth get voted into existence? It cannot. Just because a majority think a particular way, does that make it right? No. And when Luther campaigned for going back to the Bible, in a way he was right, to the extent that he also brought people back to common sense, but definitely he was not right if he meant only the Bible, because the Bible can be interpreted in many ways. And what he introduced into Western religion was this idea of popular vote. I don't mean literally a vote. I mean that people think that because everybody thinks so, it has to be true. That simply is not true. The majority, in fact, is usually wrong. The minority has a possibility of being right. But truth doesn't come from the Pope, doesn't come from an organization, doesn't come from a book. It comes from a wise reading of that book. And this wise reading depends on simply one thing: wisdom. The disciples of Jesus were the disciples of a great master. And yet even they, when he said, "I have meat to eat that ye know not of," thought he was talking about some sandwich he'd secreted in a pocket on his person. Even they didn't understand what he was talking about. And at one point, just to test their intuition and to test their readiness to carry on his mission, he said, "Unless you eat my body, drink my blood, and eat my flesh, you can in no wise find the kingdom of God." He didn't even bother to explain that there was a deep meaning behind that. He left it up to them. Sink or swim is what he was telling them, and most of them left. It says so in the Bible. From that moment on, many walked no more with him. And he said to his close disciples, "Will you also leave me?" And they said, "Where will we go? This is our truth." But they felt something from him, and that was their truth, not his words. They just had to admit they didn't understand his words. But the real meaning of those words was very mystical. Had to do with the Christ consciousness. You have to, the energy that flows through the universe is the blood of Christ. And to eat his flesh means to become one with that infinite. Did he ever explain it? We don't know that he did. The Bible doesn't do it. You have to have wisdom to understand these things. There are things that are said in the Bible that contradict themselves even. Jesus said, don't hide your light under a bushel, but let it so shine before men that your works shall be visible to all, and people will glorify your Father who is in heaven. But what does he say? In the very next chapter of St. Matthew, he says, don't let your deeds be known. Take your prayer into your closet. Don't be like the Pharisees who beat big drums before they make great donations to the temple. Seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? It wasn't, of course it wasn't. But wisdom is what's needed. And you can't say that because I've read this in the Bible, it's true. What you've read with the Bible has to filter itself through your own mind. And if you're stupid, you'll find stupidity. And if you're wise, you'll find wisdom. We have to become wise. So what's common sense? Well, first of all, it has to be based on your experience of life. If what anybody says doesn't jibe with your experience, you have to at least say, well, I haven't experienced it. I maybe don't understand what he's saying. But you can't say, yes, it's so. Yes, Master. No. Master didn't like that, didn't want that. Jesus didn't want that. The masters throw challenges to the disciples just to make them think a little bit. I'll never forget one time a story that I've mentioned in the past, where Master said to me, asked me, I had studied astronomy as a young teenager, and so he asked me, why doesn't the Earth go back into the sun? If the sun is what? No, he asked me, why does the Earth keep circulating around the sun? And I said, well, sir, I thought, well, gosh, does he really want this primitive a lesson in astronomy? But I said it's because of the centrifugal force in the Earth's movement that keeps it wanting to keep flying out into space. And he said, then why doesn't it get drawn into the sun? No. Why doesn't it fly out from the sun? And I said, well, sir, that's the gravity of the sun that holds it to it. And so there's this balance between these two forces. He didn't say anything. I went away thinking that maybe I'd taught him something, but I couldn't really believe it. I thought, did he really want that? Months later, I understood that what he was really talking about was in allegory explaining the soul's relationship to God. On the one hand, it's God's love that holds us to him. On the other hand, it's the ego's pull by desires and so on to get away. And we can't get away and we can't go back. into the heart of God because of that oppositional pull. Wonderful allegory, but did he explain it? No. He left it for me to figure out. And this happened in teaching. It happens in the teaching of all great masters. Sometimes Master even had a very interesting, but you might say unusual way of teaching people. Because sometimes he'd talk to somebody and that person would keep on coming up with reasonable objections and reasonable answers. And so Master would then sometimes say something totally illogical. And this reasoning person was so stunned, he was silent for a moment. And in that mental silence, Master could say what he was really trying to get through. Because in that silence, he was receptive. But you see, again, a master's way of training people and teaching people is not necessarily one that you'd find in a university. A very interesting thing he said to me. He said, after I'm gone, I want the monks, and this is something I've written here in the place called Ananda. After I'm gone, I want the monks separate from the nuns, living in a separate place altogether. He said this to me 2 or 3 times with great force. And I was astounded later to find out that he'd never said it to anybody else. And it became a puzzle why I was in charge of the monks, okay, but I wasn't in charge of the organization. He didn't put me on the board of directors. Why? I was a young boy, really. I was 24. Why did he tell me this and not tell it to the people who were really running things? Didn't tell it to anybody else. One thing that became even more puzzling to me was that Señor Cuarón from Mexico City came up there. He was a very close disciple. And Master said to him, this is Cuarón repeated it to me, I see you in a building down there on the corner of this property, where in fact years later the monks' monastery the ashram was built. So Master saw that the monks would have an ashram on that property. So why did he first not tell the people who were running things, and second, actually tell somebody that he saw him in that monastery, knowing, in other words, that there would not be an obedience or a fulfillment of what he wanted in moving it elsewhere, not even telling anybody that. Why did he tell me? Many times in my life it's happened that I've wondered about something and haven't had an answer. Then somebody else asks me, and then instantly I get an answer. So David Praver asked me this just recently in Italy. And he said, well, why did he say this to you and not to anybody else? And why did he even contradict himself in talking to Cuarón? And I took it into meditation. I said, well, yeah, Master, I've been wondering about this, but now I really want to know, because he wants to know. Instantly I understood. He said it to me. He couldn't tell me because it wasn't suitable at that time what he saw for my future, that I would have to be out of the work, separate from the women running the work. It would be necessary. But he couldn't tell me that, so he had to get my mind thinking of somehow working apart from them. And that was his way of doing it. You see what a subtle way he had of teaching? I've spent my life, I tell you, meditating on his words, meditating on his actions, meditating on the very expressions in his eyes, the tone in his voice, because I have found that in every way he was a walking, talking, living, breathing scripture. And that just by that meditation I have learned so much. I've tried to understand why. And now my way of asking things is not so much why, but how would you do it if you were here now? And I have seen again and again that clarifies the issue for me. Not to do anything the way I might see it, but to see it through his eyes. Now, common sense. Common sense is based on experience, yes. But what kind of experience? You can't say every experience is equal to every other experience. His experience of God would not be that of a toad out here, just with a very limited vocabulary. I was saying, 35. Then he started in on 5. And then I don't know, maybe it's a language that I don't know, but He actually had some other sound he threw into the pot. But you can't say that he had the wisdom of you and me. His vocabulary even was very limited. But don't think that words do it either. A vocabulary can expand the consciousness. It can also limit the consciousness. By the very fact that you have words. Uma, one time, some French boy was asking her to teach him English. And I don't know if the example was exact, but it'll do. That she was saying that when you take a photograph, you have to say you take it from the window. And he said, no, that's not right. You take it after the window. Because in French you say, depuis la fenêtre. And she insisted, no, this is not so. So he left her as a teacher. He thought, well, she's ignorant. Well, believe it or not, I've mentioned this as an example to various Frenchmen to show how words limit our understanding. And I said that you all say depuis, but we say from, not after. They said, no, it should be. Ask anybody, it's depuis. So we need to understand that words are also limiting. As Master said in his poem, Prayer at Evening Tide, oh, how maddening. I can pray no more with words, but only with wistful yearning of my soul. And Teresa of Avila said that the fourth stage of prayer, the mind can no longer think. You go beyond words, you go beyond thought. And that's where common sense can take you that far. It can't take you further. So we do have to use our common sense. We have to say, well, does it correspond to my experience of life? But we have to understand that that experience is limited. And finally, it has to be intuitive experience. And that experience, as I said last Sunday, is mostly in the heart. That's why I said, if your mind understands something one way, but your heart rejects that understanding, trust your heart. The mind can go in all kinds of ways and justify all kinds of reasoning. The heart, not quite so badly. The emotions of the heart, yes, they can reject everything. But when the heart is calm, there is a feeling that comes that, yes, this is right. That's what happened to me. I read Master's book in New York in 1948. I knew this was what I wanted. I took the next bus from New York to Los Angeles. The first words I addressed to him were, I want to be your disciple. Something I never dreamed I'd say to anybody. I was very independent. But I have never for a moment had a thought of changing that decision. When you act from your heart, and when the heart is calm, there is a level of intuition that you've all had. You recognize it, you know it. This is what we have to cling to, because Yogananda said, intuition is the soul's power of knowing God. And as you depend on intuition, that power increases. And more you understand. And so many things you read, these fools like Jean-Paul Sartre, who is respected in modern pedagogical and intellectual circles, but only because he was highly intelligent. He was an intelligent idiot. He had, basically his whole philosophy was that man is radically free. Nothing to prove it, no fact to substantiate that statement. No, his reasoning went like this: man is radically free, therefore man is radically free. What kind of reasoning is that? But it's so carefully done, so intelligently done, that lots of intelligent people have fallen into that trap. And that's why I wrote that book. That's why it's now coming out under the name Out of the Labyrinth. It was first called Crises in Modern Thought. But these are the things that we need to keep in mind. Always recognize your ignorance, that it is ignorance. Always be aware that you have the capacity for error and that capacity is infinite. But also be aware that you have the capacity for wisdom, and that capacity, if there is humility, If there is that understanding that this brain can't understand anything, really, but if my soul knows it, if I recognize it deep within, then that is your truth. And you will find that that truth surfaces in every culture, every religion, every country, every age. There is no religion that has said, my children, for a change, be dishonest. For a change, lie and cheat. None of them say it. They all teach the basic rules, not because it's socially convenient, but because there is something in the heart of man that knows this is so. You recognize goodness, and you recognize squalor and dishonesty and the disease of ignorance. Inside you, you can't help but recognize it. Go by that feeling. Don't listen to anybody else. Always come back to your center and say, does this jibe with what I have experienced? Knowing that what you have experienced may be limited, but it's all you've got to go on. Go with that, and you can grow in that until finally you reach that infinite, that ultimately, as Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is within you.